will now begin the 15th lecture on the books of Samuel. Today we will begin with 2 Samuel chapter 13. The title is Amnon and Tamar. Let's look at the main points. First, Amnon falls in love with Tamar, verses 1 through 2. Second, Jonadab comes up with a plan, verses 3 through 6. Third, Amnon rapes Tamar, verses 7 through 19. Fourth, the king becomes furious, and Tamar lives as a desolate woman, verses 20 through 22. Fifth, Absalom kills Amnon, verses 23 through 29. Sixth, the king's sons flee and mourn, verses 30 through 36. Seventh, Absalom flees to Geshur, verses 37 through 39. Read verse 1. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. David's third son, Absalom, had a sister named Tamar. David's eldest son, Amnon, fell in love with Tamar. Lust of the eyes entered Amnon, and he fell in love with his half-sister. Leviticus chapter 20, verse 17. David did not overcome the lust of the eyes and committed the sin of adultery in the past. Chapter 11, verses 2 through 5. This sin entered David's house, and David's son committed this sin. David repented of his sin, but the sin influenced his descendants. Verse 3. Now Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man. Amnon had a shrewd friend named Jonadab. Jonadab and Amnon were cousins. Amnon asked Jonadab many questions. Jonadab taught Amnon to rape Tamar. It is important to make good friends. Amnon was friends with the wicked and sly Jonadab, and he failed. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. Jonadab told Amnon about a plan. Jonadab told Amnon to pretend he was ill, and then to ask of the king. He told him to say, I would like my sister Tamar to come and give me something to eat. Thus King David listened to Amnon's request. David sent Tamar and told her to prepare food for Amnon. David should not have approved of Amnon's request. Verse 8. So Tamar went to the house of her brother Amnon, who was lying down. She took some dough, kneaded it, made the bread in his sight, and baked it. Tamar obeyed her father, King David, and baked bread in his sight and served him. Amnon then raped Tamar. Tamar pleaded with him. Verse 12. Don't, my brother, she said to him, don't force me. Such a thing should not be done in Israel. Don't do this wicked thing. Tamar told Amnon not to do such a wicked thing in Israel. However, Amnon ignored her and raped his sister. Then Amnon was filled with hatred, and he chased her away. Amnon's heart changed from lust to hatred by the work of the devil. When man sins, it is joyful and sweet, but the result will be bitter. Hence, God's judgment will follow. Verse 18. So his servant put her out and bolted the door after her. She was wearing a richly ornamented robe, for this was the kind of garment the virgin daughters of the king wore. Amnon raped his sister, and then he chased her out. Then Tamar put ashes on her head, tore her clothes, and went home. Tamar's brother Absalom then found out what had happened. Verse 21. When King David heard all this, he was furious. David heard that Amnon raped Tamar, and he became furious. However, David did not punish Amnon. This was wrong. As a result, Absalom later killed Amnon. We must rightfully give punishments for sins. Verse 23. 2 years later, when Absalom's sheep shearers were at Baal Hazor near the border of Ephraim, he invited all the king's sons to come there. It was 2 years after Amnon raped Tamar. Absalom harbored resentment for 2 years. Then Absalom invited the king's sons to come to where his sheep shearers were. Verse 28. Absalom ordered his men, "Listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. Don't be afraid. Have not I given you this order? Be strong and brave." Absalom ordered his men to kill Amnon when he became drunk. Thus, Amnon was eventually killed. Verse 32. But Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother, said, "My lord should not think that they killed all the princes. Only Amnon is dead." This has been Absalom's expressed intention ever since the day Amnon raped his sister Tamar. Jonadab was a wicked man. He taught Amnon to rape Tamar. Jonadab did not feel any guilt, but rather he flattered David. Verse 37. Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. But King David mourned for his son every day. Absalom fled to Talmai in Geshur. King David mourned for Absalom. Verse 39. And the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. 3 years passed since Absalom killed Amnon. David forgot about his sadness for the death of Amnon. David longed for Absalom. This was David's mistake. Even if Absalom was his son, David should have rightfully punished him. Hence, Absalom would later betray his father David. We will continue with 2 Samuel chapter 14. The title is The Woman from Tekoa. Let's look at the main points. First, Joab sends the woman from Tekoa to the king. Verses 1 through 3. Second, the plan of the woman from Tekoa. Verses 4 through 20. Third, the king tells Joab to bring Absalom. Verses 21 through 24. Fourth, Absalom's appearance highly praised. Verses 25 through 27. Fifth, Absalom sees the king's face through Joab. Verses 28 through 33. Read verses 1 through 2. Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, "Pretend you are in mourning. Dress in mourning clothes and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead." Absalom killed Amnon, but King David's heart longed for Absalom as time went by. Joab knew David's heart. Joab then brought a woman from Tekoa. Joab taught the woman of his plan. Joab told the woman to pretend she was in mourning and go before the king. Verse 4. When the woman from Tekoa went to the king, she fell with her face to the ground to pay him honor, and she said, "Help me, O king." The woman from Tekoa told David that she was a widow. She had 2 sons, but the older son killed the younger son in the field. Therefore, the whole clan wanted to kill the older son for killing his younger brother. Numbers chapter 35, verses 18 and 19. This meant that King David should have compassion on the older son for killing his younger brother and forgive him. This was so that David would forgive Absalom and bring him home. Verse 12. Then the woman said, "Let your servant speak a word to my lord the king." "Speak," he replied. Verse 13. The woman said, "Why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son." The woman meant, "Why don't you bring back Absalom?" Verse 15. And now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he will do what his servant asks. The woman from Tekoa asked David in a flattering way to save her. The woman lied to turn David's heart around. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 17. It says, "If anyone takes the life of a human being, he must be put to death." Therefore, David should have rightfully punished Absalom. Verse 18. Then the king said to the woman, "Do not keep from me the answer to what I am going to ask you. Let my lord the king speak," the woman said. Verse 19. The king asked, "Isn't the hand of Joab with you in all this?" The woman answered, "As surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left from anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this, and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. King David listened to the woman's words, and he knew that Joab instructed the woman to speak all these things. Hence, David ordered Joab to bring back Absalom. King David ultimately did wrong through Joab and the woman. David did not act justly towards Absalom. Later, David and Absalom would face great harm. Verse 21. The king said to Joab, "Very well, I will do it. Go, bring back the young man Absalom." David told Joab to bring back Absalom. Joab brought Absalom to Jerusalem. David did not want to see Absalom's face, so he sent him home. It was right for King David to hate Absalom's sin. However, it was wrong of David to not punish Absalom. It was wrong for David to not punish Absalom. Verse 25. In all Israel there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot there was no blemish in him. Absalom was beautiful and handsome in appearance. All of Israel praised him. However, Absalom did not have faith, and he was a wicked man. He killed his own brother. He got revenge. He then betrayed his father. Verse 28. Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Absalom lived in Jerusalem for 2 years, but did not see the king's face. Absalom then asked Joab to let him see the king's face. Yet Joab did not listen to him. Absalom then sent his servants to set fire to Joab's field. Because of this, Joab introduced Absalom to the king. Verse 33. So Joab went to the king and told him this. Then the king summoned Absalom, and he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. Joab told David about Absalom's request. David listened and summoned Absalom. The king kissed Absalom. This meant that King David forgave Absalom. However, Absalom did not truly repent. Therefore, David forgave Absalom who did not repent. We will continue with chapter 15. The title is Absalom's Conspiracy. Let's look at the main points. First, Absalom prepares an army and steals the hearts of men. Verses 1 through 6. Second, Absalom conspires against the king. Verses 7 through 12. Third, the king flees from Absalom and leaves Jerusalem. Verses 13 through 18. Fourth, Ittai the Gittite stays with the king. Verses 19 through 23. Fifth, the priest sends the Ark of the Covenant of God back to Jerusalem. Verses 24 through 26. Sixth, the king makes Zadok a messenger. Verses 27 through 29. Seventh, the king weeps as he goes, and Ahithophel takes part in the conspiracy. Verses 30 through 31. Eighth, the king sends Hushai to Absalom, and Absalom enters Jerusalem. Verses 32 through 37. Verse 1. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses, and with 50 men to run ahead of him. Absalom met David and received forgiveness. Afterwards, Absalom prepared chariots and horses for himself. He steadily made preparations to betray his father. Absalom did not truly repent even after he returned to Jerusalem. David did not look after Absalom, but let him be. Hence, Absalom's conspiracy grew. David loved his sons, but did not punish or rule over them. Proverbs chapter 22, verse 15. When people came to the king with complaints, Absalom kissed them. Then Absalom kept the people from going to the king with their problems. Absalom made himself king and spoke to the people. Absalom put up a wall between the king and the people. Absalom made the people complain against the king. Absalom stole the hearts of the people. Verse 6. Absalom behaved in this way toward all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice, and so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Verse 7. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord." Absalom prepared for his betrayal for 4 years. Then Absalom asked his father for permission to go to Hebron. Absalom arrived in Hebron. Then Absalom sent news that he was king in Hebron. Absalom stirred up the people of Israel so that they would follow him. Verse 11. 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They had been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. When Absalom went to Hebron, 200 able men from Jerusalem followed him. The 200 men knew nothing about the matter. They thought that Absalom had gotten approval because he was the king's son. Absalom then won over Ahithophel the counselor. 1 Chronicles chapter 27, verse 33. Ahithophel was very wise in giving advice. Chapter 16, verse 23. Verse 13. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." Absalom conspired against the king, and many hearts turned to Absalom. The people followed Absalom with a mob psychology. Verse 14. Then David said to all his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." David was afraid of Absalom and fled with his officials and entire household. David fled. David left 10 concubines behind. God's prophecy was fulfilled. Chapter 12, verse 11, chapter 16, verses 20 through 22. Verse 19. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom. You are a foreigner, an exile from your homeland." Ittai the Gittite of the Philistines came to help David. He helped David until the end. Chapter 18, verse 2. Many people helped David. They stayed loyal to him and also kept their faith. Verse 24. Zadok was there too, and all the Levites who were with him were carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. Zadok the priest and the Levites carried the Ark of Covenant of God out of Jerusalem. Abiathar the priest also went with them. David then told them to take the Ark of God back to Jerusalem. This was because David believed that God would lead him back to Jerusalem. Verse 26. But if he says, "I am not pleased with you," then I am ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him. David believed that God would not allow him to go back to Jerusalem if God was not pleased with him. David decided to surrender to God's providence, even if it meant that he would never return to Jerusalem. David believed in God's sovereignty, and he had faith to entrust life and death to God's providence. Verse 27. The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Aren't you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, son of Abiathar. You and Abiathar take your 2 sons with you." King David told Zadok and Abiathar to take the Ark of God back to Jerusalem. Then he told them to give him news about Jerusalem through Ahimaaz and Jonathan. Verse 30. But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. All the people with him covered their heads too, and were weeping as they went up. King David and his men covered their heads and walked barefoot up the Mount of Olives. Then David received the news that Ahithophel joined Absalom. David prayed to God that Ahithophel's counsel would turn into foolishness. Ahithophel was a very wise man. Yet God was able to turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness. It was possible if God helped him. Chapter 17, verses 1 through 23. Verse 32. When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai the Archite was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David's friend Hushai welcomed David. David then told Hushai to return to Jerusalem. David commanded him, frustrate Ahithophel's advice, and do not let Absalom receive advice from Ahithophel. David also said, send me news of Jerusalem. Verse 37. So David's friend Hushai arrived in Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. Hushai went to Jerusalem by David's request to end Ahithophel's counsel. Absalom also entered Jerusalem. Absalom became king. King David knew through Absalom's conspiracy that this was God's punishment. David humbly repented and became humble. Then David put his hope in God. We will continue with 2 Samuel chapter 16. The title is Shimei's Curse. Let's look at the main points. First, Ziba slanders his master, verses 1 through 4. Second, Shimei curses David, verses 5 through 8. Third, David receives Shimei's curse with faith. He receives it with faith, verses 9 through 14. Fourth, Hushai says that he will serve Absalom as king, verses 15 through 19. Fifth, Absalom listens to Ahithophel's advice and sleeps with his father's concubines, verses 20 through 23. Read verse 1. When David had gone a short distance beyond the summit, there was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, and 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. David was on the run. Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth, came to David with food. Why did Ziba come with so many gifts? Ziba wanted to find King David, and he wanted to slander his master. Ziba wanted to steal his master's inheritance. Ziba was evil in wanting to betray his master. In verses 3 and 4, Ziba slandered Mephibosheth with lies. Chapter 19, verses 24 through 27. However, Mephibosheth was on his best behavior and participated in hardships. Chapter 19, verse 24. King David believed Ziba's words of slander, and he listened to him. David made a wrong judgment. Verse 5. As King David approached Bahurim, A man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. Shimei of Saul's clan came and cursed David. Shimei threw stones at David and cursed him. Shimei harbored bad feelings and a grudge against David for a long time. Shimei's curse was baseless. Proverbs chapter 26, verse 2. David did nothing wrong against Saul's family. Verse 9. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, "Why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head." Abishai spoke to King David, "Kill Shimei." King David did not give his permission. Verse 10. But the king said, "What do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? If he is cursing because the Lord said to him, 'Curse David,' who can ask, 'Why do you do this?'" David told him not to kill Shimei. David believed that Shimei cursed him because God told him to. David believed that Absalom conspired against him because of his sin, and David repented. David believed that God would repay him with good through Shimei's curse, and David looked forward to it. Shimei continued to curse David. Verse 16. Then Hushai the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Hushai went to Absalom, as David told him to, and said, "Long live the king!" Absalom then asked him, "Why didn't you go with your friend David?" Verse 19. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you. Hushai said that he would now be faithful to Absalom, the new king. Verses 20 through 21. Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" Ahithophel answered, "Lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." Ahithophel gave Absalom wicked advice. He told Absalom to lie with his father's concubines for all the people to see. This would show that Absalom surely betrayed his father. This would show that Absalom would no longer be in harmony with his father David. Then the people would be relieved and follow Absalom. Absalom would conspire greatly against David. Hence Absalom listened to Ahithophel's advice and lied with his father's concubines in a tent on the palace roof. This happened just as the prophet Nathan prophesied. Chapter 12, verse 11. In this way, the influence of sin is frightening and tragic. Absalom committed a great sin in raping his father's concubines. This was disobedience of God's law, and he committed the sin of adultery. Here we will conclude the 15th lecture on the books of Samuel. Thank you.